Sega.
Fantasy Zone is a colourful and cute shoot-'em-up where your living spacecraft, called Opa-Opa, has to save numerous planets from financial collapse, as someone is stealing all the money. You do this by blasting bad guys who then turn back into cash, which you can then use to upgrade your ship. Eventually, in a riff on Star Wars, you discover the ultimate bad guy is your dad. This is definitely a pretty unique game. First, we'll look at the 1986 arcade version, running on Sega's System 16B hardware. This I'll be emulating in MAME. Next, we'll look at the version included in the Japanese-only Sega Memorial Selection. I'll run this on Windows 10 with DG Voodoo 2 to fix missing graphics. After that, we'll take a look at the versions included in the Ryu Gagatoku studio games to date, which started with Yakuza 0 in 2018, Yakuza 6 The Song of Life in 2021, Yakuza Like a Dragon in 2020, yes, the 7th game came out before the 6th one on PC, and rounding off with Judgment and Lost Judgment, both of which eventually hit the PC in 2022. As you can probably see, there's a lot of similarities here, but are there any differences? Keep watching. The arcade version released in 1986 on Sega System 16B hardware. The game originally appeared on Sega's City generic arcade units, as shown on the left, as well as sit-down cocktail table units, shown in the middle. The game could also be installed into various other arcade units, meaning there are a number of cabinets that this can appear in. The game begins with the title warping in, followed by some gameplay from the first round. The high score table appears, and then the logo is shown again. This repeats with several different backgrounds and weapons being demoed. After 3 gameplay sequences, the story scrolls onto screen, and this is so unique, I shall read it out. Long ago, far away in space, there existed a fantasy zone where a courageous hero called Opa-Opa, the player, fought in a valiant cause to rescue the fantasy zone from its enemies. In the space year 1422, the interplanetary monetary system collapsed, causing all of the planets to become panic-stricken. According to an official inquiry made by the Space Guild, someone is leading the men on planet forces, using them to steal the foreign currencies of the other planets, and with the funds construct a huge fortress in the fantasy zone. To put an end to their ambitious plans, Opa-Opa promptly takes off for the fantasy zone where, presumably, the rest of the game happens. Upon starting the game, the story is quickly recapped before you get blasting. Each of the 7 rounds contains 10 bases, highlighted by the red circles at the bottom of the screen. Destroying each releases money that you can collect. A floating shop soon appears, allowing you to spend your earnings on upgrading your craft. Most weapons you collect have a limited time span, shown in the top right corner. After destroying 10 bases, a boss will appear. In the first round, this takes the form of a leaf-spitting tree trunk. Upon defeating it, you collect a lot of coins that you can immediately spend at the start of the second round. Despite all these weapons, the game is tricky, with enemies starting to fire at you and moving in less predictable patterns. Eventually you'll touch something and turn into a pretty fireworks show. The second round boss seems to be a test tube that spits out bullets, surrounded by spheres. Round 3 is a desert planet. When your limited weapon eventually runs out, you'll often encounter a cell balloon. Flying into this allows you to select different weapons, should you be carrying more than one. The boss here is best described as a floating statue covered in guns. Round 4 is a futuristic looking place where all the enemy bases are drilling out of the ground. Here the enemy forces really get annoying. As you may have suspected, I'm playing this with a cheat that allows hundreds of lives. The end of round boss is a cool looking robot with 2 arms, but is fairly simple to destroy. The 5th round is a snowy level, with even more annoying enemy forces that can quickly overwhelm you. Should you make it to the boss, it takes the form of snowmen, who pelt you with increasingly large snowballs. After 40 minutes of playing the game, I decided I'd had enough at this point. It's perfectly possible to get further though. Indeed, there are videos showing single credit runs on YouTube, but I'm far from a Fantasy Zone expert. After another couple of levels of increasing difficulty, you'll eventually discover that your dad is the ultimate bad guy, as shown in this screenshot, with your opa-opa character eventually feeling a bit upset once you defeat him. All in all, it's a rather strange narrative for a particularly difficult yet unique looking game. As this game is very difficult and I'm pretty unskilled, let's see how far I get on 1 credit. Place your bets now. Sega Memorial Selection was a Japanese-only PC release from 1998. It collected 3 classic Sega games, Pengo, Flicky and Fantasy Zone. These pictures are of my own copy that I imported from Japan. Fantasy Zone is actually pretty close to the arcade in this collection, certainly closer than the ports of Pengo and Flicky. It scales the image to the nearest integer, however, which means the game has small black borders above and below the image. Also, the on-screen radar, round number and lives remaining have shifted up a little. I suspect this is due to the game being based on the Sega Saturn port, where those elements may have been moved up so they never fall off the bottom of a television screen's safe viewing area. The audio is also a little more compressed and muffled. Anyway, let's try one credit of this version. As I got a bit further than the arcade, and this looks so similar, I'll edit the video to speed things along a little. At the time of making this video, Fantasy Zone has appeared in a number of games by Ryuga Gotoku Studio. It's playable in Yakuza 0 from 2018, Yakuza 6 A Song of Life from 2021, Yakuza Like a Dragon from 2020, as mentioned the 7th game in the series came to the PC before the 6th one. Plus it appears in Judgment and Lost Judgment, both of which made it to the PC in 2022 once licensing rights were sorted out on the lead actor. Yakuza 0 is set in the 1980s, so once you've unlocked the game as part of the plot, you need to go into the Sega High-Tech Land arcade to find it. You'll notice they've modelled the Sega City arcade units that I showed earlier. This is the only Yakuza title with an amusing introduction to playing the game. Once you've been shown the controls, you can then adjust the screen size. We'll go for full screen non-stretched. This is the only version of Yakuza which hides the fake arcade plastic surrounding the sides of the screen when running like this. One issue with the Yakuza 0 port is the game often loads with this soft blur filter applied. It doesn't always do this though, and sometimes appears pixel sharp. All the classic arcade games are affected with this issue in Yakuza 0. The second issue is that the picture is scaled slightly differently, with a tiny part of the top and bottom of the screen being cut off. This means the radar, round number and lives remaining are very close to the bottom of the screen. I'll go through this in detail in the Pixel Compare a bit later on. Yakuza 0 is the only game in the Yakuza and Judgment titles to lack a rapid fire button, which makes shooting a bit more tiring here, but then that's similar to the original arcade. In Yakuza 6, The Song of Life, Sega's high-tech land has morphed into Club Sega. You'll find the game upstairs. This is the only version of Yakuza where you can choose the difficulty level simply by choosing the cabinet you want to play. In-game there's a small amount of background street noise still noticeable. Once again you can set the screen aspect ratio before playing. Unlike all the other Yakuza and Judgment games though, the picture is scaled correctly with no pixels being chopped off. I expect this might be related to Q-Lock handling this port, unlike the other Yakuza titles. The blur filter that sometimes appears in Yakuza 0 is also gone. However, the audio is slightly more quiet. Yakuza Like a Dragon has the cabinet in a smaller Club Sega arcade. This port is the same as the one in Yakuza 0, with a fraction of the top and bottom pixels chopped off. At least it's pixel sharp. The audio is much louder than previous versions, but the scrolling feels a touch less smooth. In Judgment, you'll find the game in the smaller Club Sega arcade as well. When you start the game, you'll notice the background street noise keeps playing quite loudly, which is a bit annoying. Gameplay-wise, this is identical to the version in Yakuza 0 and Yakuza Like a Dragon. Finally we come to Lost Judgment. The game is again in the smaller Club Sega. Unlike all the other Yakuza versions, the arcade difficulty is tied to the difficulty level you set in Lost Judgment, with you starting with more or less lives depending on the difficulty level you chose. Sound is slightly quieter here, but at least there's no street noises still playing in the background. But which is the best version? It's hard to say as they all play fairly similarly. Yakuza 0 hides the fake plastic surround when running full screen, but lacks rapid fire. Yakuza 6 shows the full screen image as per MAME, but there's a tiny bit of noticeable street noise in the background. For me, Lost Judgment might slightly have the edge due to no weird background noise and slightly smoother scrolling than Yakuza Like a Dragon. Let's compare all 7 versions of the game at the pixel level. We'll look at the same frame of gameplay in each version. First, here's the arcade version set to integer scaling, meaning each pixel is the correct size, which causes the game to have black borders at the top and bottom. I've chosen this as the version in Sega Memorial Selection is very similar. So let's wipe across to that now. As you can see, many elements are positioned slightly differently. Going back to the arcade, I've now set it to the actual pixel aspect ratio of 10:7 that the arcade runs in, which makes it a bit wider. Let's wipe across to the version in Yakuza 0 now. You'll notice a fraction of the top and bottom pixels go missing, as well as the occasionally appearing soft filter effect. As I mentioned earlier, the 7th Yakuza game, Like a Dragon, also uses this port, but runs without the blur filter, as shown here. Sadly, the fake plastic arcade surround stays on when playing full screen, and appears in all the following titles. If I now wipe across to Judgment, you'll see it's pixel identical to Yakuza Like a Dragon. Similarly, wiping across to Lost Judgment shows once again it's an identical port. Now let's go back to the arcade running at 4:3 aspect ratio. Watch what happens when I wipe across to the Yakuza 6 version. It's pixel perfect. It's just a shame the fake plastic arcade surrounds are present. It's time to go head to head. We'll compare the first stage. I'll edit the clips to ensure they stay roughly in sync, although I might enter the shop at different times between versions. The arcade original is a unique, rock-hard, but beautiful looking and sounding game. The version in Sega Memorial Selection has items placed slightly differently, but plays well despite the audio being a touch less clear. The version in Yakuza 0 can appear soft filtered and lacks the rapid fire addition of other versions. Yakuza 6's Song of Life support is scaled to 4:3 aspect ratio correctly, but has a little background street noise. Yakuza Like a Dragon's port is fine, but feels a touch less smooth. The version in Judgment has loud background street noise spoiling things slightly, whilst the Lost Judgment version is overall fine, if slightly more quiet. I don't think I have an overall clear winner here, apart from Sega's coin-taking ability of the original arcade version. This game is not easy. If you like this comparison of Fantasy Zone, then please say so with a like. Or subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment, and save the financial system of multiple worlds by destroying your dad, of course. And join me next time for a platforming classic and its interesting PC ports.